Life is hard. It's also just so gorgeous and beautiful, right? Like some days it's so gorgeous that you just have to look away, not to sob. You know, you see a friend, you hear a beautiful song, just walking the dog, the sunrise, the sunset. But life is hard. I think I officially decided that last Sunday morning. You know, it's not like I got to 60 and it hadn't occurred to me, but I got an early morning text that was kind of a gut punch. It was not anything I expected. And there's been a lot of that in our little community and in my circle of friends this year. There's been cancer, there's been addiction, there's been separation and divorce, there's been lost jobs. And this was just one of those things. And I just thought, oh my God, life is just so unbelievably hard. And of course, we are, to be honest, privileged people who have resources and family and community and friends who can hold us up, right? I mean, that statistic that 32% of Americans don't have $400 if there's a crisis, it's now 37% of Americans, up from 5%. And in many ways, that kind of vulnerability and fragility is much more like the first people who heard Jesus speak. You know, they lived in a world before there was crop insurance. The Roman Empire was not known as a place with a big safety net. They lived in a world before modern medicine. There weren't antibiotics. Life expectancy was maybe half of what our life expectancy was. People would have a couple of kids, hoping one would live to be 5. So you can't blame them for loving these kind of parables that are about this miraculous harvest. This is one of those parables that even if you don't know scripture, it's sort of like in the vernacular, it's in art, it's kind of in songs, it's just around. So the person goes out to sow, they throw some seed, some lands on the ground, on the path, the birds quickly eat it. Some of the other seed lands in the rocks, and there's not much depth of soil, and so they sprout up quickly, and then the sun withers them, and it's lost. And then some seed grows up among the thorns, which choke them out. So now we have 3 elaborations of failure. We got failure and failure and failure, but we're kind of moving, you know, the seed is sort of sprouting. And so now the first people who heard Jesus speak would have expected success, and we get success. Some of the seed falls on good soil and the crop comes up, and look what you've got, 100-fold, 60-fold, 40-fold. It's a little seed. And what does it do? It feeds all the kids in the village. It feeds the whole village. It feeds maybe as far as the eye can see. It's like we planted this church here to focus on peace and justice and the beloved community. And what happened? Our relationships have become more whole, more rich. Violence in the city has dropped to nothing, right? All the business owners and the mayor, you know, the head of the Royals have come out and said, we can't possibly imagine a stadium until we have plenty of affordable housing and jobs and a walkable path, and then maybe we'll put, I mean, the whole city has just been turned around. Everything, and the legislators in Topeka and Jefferson City have said, oh my goodness, how stupid were we to try to take away people's rights to make basic decisions about their bodies. We're sorry, we'll never do that again, and now we're gonna focus all on pre-K and junior college instead of widening I-70, right? Well, that's really not what you get, is it? And honestly, it's really not what you get in the parable either. The more we know about archaeology and the digs at Qumran, and the more we learn about agriculture in the 1st century, the more we know that this was an average harvest. A harvest that returned 100-fold or 120-fold. It would have been considered good, but not like, oh my gosh, the whole world is different. And they had stories about crazy harvest, little sayings like, put a spigot in a grape and wine pours out. Pluck a grape and you get a whole keg of wine. They had these unbelievable stories like that, stories about incredible transformation. But this was a different kind of story. It was a story that's really kind of about our lives. Kind of, if you imagine our life, kind of like a triangle, kind of like failure, an elaboration of failure, some modest success, and the ordinary. And then somehow God just found in the very midst of all of that, right? As opposed to, poof, everything's perfect. When my daughter went away to college 10 years ago, she went to Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, which is a quintessential down on its luck town. I mean, they actually wrote the book in the New York Times about it, Boom, Bust, Exodus. Illinois, like a lot of the upper Midwest, got hit hard with manufacturing loss. They lost 37% of their jobs kind of in the years leading up to the recession of 2008. And Galesburg was really centered around the Maytag plant. And for years, there were fears that the Maytag plant would leave. And when it did, when it folded up, went to Matamoros, Maquiladora, sweatshop, I mean, overnight, the town just plummeted. And it went from 30-something thousand to 20-something thousand, just absolutely devastating. And Eden started college a few years later, and she said to me, when you come, we have to go eat at this little place on Main Street, Q's Cafe. It's just incredible. This amazing couple, Walt and Annette, they're trying to bring the town back, and it's got the best food, all kinds of vegetarian stuff. You'll love it. There's one room with little, chairs and tables, and another room with couches and art. And she was right. I mean, it was delicious and amazing and nourishing. And I couldn't decide between the corn chowder and the butternut squash, but I had a lot of time because Walt talked to every single person who came in, right? Because he cared about people, and because he had a vision for Galesburg. He imagined bringing this town back. And all the college students would gather there, and Eden and her friends started the GO project, Galesburg Organizing Project, to tackle the food desert issue and try to bring the town back. And one day, this woman came in from California. She was there for her aunt's funeral. She was supposed to be there for 3 days, but rental car issue and the aunt, all kinds of stuff. She was there for 3 weeks, and she decided instead of building her billionaire tech company in Silicon Valley for green technology, she would build it in Galesburg. And she moved there and started this job, and now there's 2,000 new jobs, and none of that happened. That's not what happened. Walt started this, Walt and Annette had this lovely cafe. For a while, it was a wonderful place for people to gather. Right down the street, other little places opened and gathered. Walt ran for mayor, and he lost. And a few years ago, he had to close the cafe, and he started driving a truck. That's life, right? And it doesn't mean that there's not sacred and beautiful and gorgeous mixed in with all of that. How he changed my daughter's life, right? Kind of opened her and thought, what could be, right? I wonder if somehow the expectation that life is going to be all of this gets in the way of seeing that life is really this. And isn't it amazing? Thought of a wise couple I met with a few years ago. They were struggling, and they were talking about expectations of one another, and they met with a therapist, and one of the jewels that they came away with was expectations are like planned resentments. Or the way I've remembered it in my head, an expectation is a down payment in disappointment. It's not that we shouldn't have expectations, right? People should treat you kindly. No one should ever hurt you, right? No one should ever, demean you, and everybody needs to pitch in, and we all need to be reasonably clean, right? But, the idea that someone is going to just be every single thing you could ever imagine forever and do everything exactly the way you want it, that the idea that your friends and your family are never going to let you down, the idea that me and Paula or Ellie or Al, we're never going to do something no. And expectations, and we know that in our kids, right? We know our kids are struggling. We know it's a tough time. We know the depression and anxiety rate for little ones and older ones and everyone is off the charts. And pretty much everybody will tell you they have a lot of different expectations than like our grandparents did, right? Once upon a time, people thought you were a good parent if you kept your kids fed and had shoes on them. Now it's like if their childhood wasn't every single thing, So looking at expectations and what is it about? And even in our own congregation, I mean, when President Obama was elected, honest to God, I thought we are going to move from all this military spending to universal pre-K and free junior college, and it's going to be a different world, and we're all going to come together, and I just thought, and look, it turns out it's incremental hard work of like, let's gather signatures so we can try to raise the minimum wage to $15 and get earned sick leave. It's hard work, and the sacred is right there in that quadrant of failure and success and the ordinary. I thought about Walt when I heard this podcast the other day on Rumble Strip. She got actually named like the best podcast by the New Yorker, but she just makes her little podcast in her little closet in her home in Vermont. She does stories about ordinary stuff. She does stories about how to survive the winter and the dogs we love and our gardens, and about town meetings that I guess people have all over Vermont. And this one was about class. She tries not to just talk about politics because, as she says, it's so divisive. But she does these podcasts with Vermont Public Radio, and she asked them if she could just go out and ask people, what class are you? So it was up in northeastern Vermont, an area called Orleans that sounds a lot like Galesburg, Illinois. People down on their luck, not a lot to do. And she just sat up outside the general store and asked people, can I ask you something? What class are you? She talked to a guy named Ethan Perry. He was 29, and he said he grew up lower middle class, he'd just think. His mother was a teacher, and his father was a carpenter. But he said now he thinks he's probably lower class, but not impoverished. At 29, he's had maybe a dozen jobs. He's worked at the Dollar General, where he works now. He worked at McDonald's, and he'd been an after-school counselor, and he'd been a phone salesperson, he'd worked in a call center, he'd worked at Planet Fitness, he named all of them. What he talked about mainly was food. It was just how hard it was to come up with something to eat, to make his small wages and his food stamps keep him fed, how he'd kind of gather the change that people would leave behind that they didn't need and use it to buy a Hot Pocket. And he talked about how hard it was because everybody was in the same boat. He felt like he was Tom Hanks in that movie Castaway, just kind of out there drifting and no one could help. But one day, someone at work offered to buy him groceries. He talked about that. She asked him at some point if he had expectations or dreams and if he thought that was helpful. And he said, well, yes. He said, because if you think about yesterday, it was cleaning toilets, and today it's mopping floors, but tomorrow it could be anything. So I've got a dream. I've got a dream. I'd like to start my own business. She said, if you could do anything, what would it be? Said, if I could do anything, it would be a pizza shop. It's like there's nothing like that anywhere around here. Nothing like that where people my age can come together. It's like it's drugs and drinking, people not taking care of themselves, nothing to do. But I could imagine this pizza shop where people could just come together and just be a community and just care for one another and just have a good time. Sower went out to sow. Some of the seeds just fell on the ground and the birds ate it right up, and some right among the rocks and they withered and died, and some of it, was choked out by the thorns, but some of it took root, right? Someone opened this little restaurant on Galesburg's Main Street. Down the street, someone opened a bakery and put a pride flag right in it. Right out there by the street, people planted flowers around the trees. A couple got a little bit of money back from their taxes, and they decided to put a few benches down in the park. Someone decided to start teaching yoga there. Then the college kids came together. They decided we can do better. We can bring one another together. College hired their very first Black president. Life began to change. Beautiful, difficult, gorgeous, tough, all of it. What more could we really expect? Amen.